Hey everybody, welcome back to the Making Space podcast. So glad you're joining us today. As always, I am joined by my esteemed co-hosts, Sarah Joy Prope and Benjamin Lindell. How are you guys? Good to see you.
Doing great. Good to be here.
Yeah, Jay, Sarah Joy, doing really well. Looking forward to our talk today.
Definitely.
Hey, this is going to seem like a random question, but it'll make sense in a moment. I wanted to ask both of you guys, have you both spent any time at all in New York City, like in the heart of the city, Manhattan?
Yeah, I have. Like 3 days. It was a super quick trip. I took the Chinatown to Chinatown bus from Washington, D.C. to New York City. And
nice.
Just explored the city. It was a lot of fun. I was a big fan of Newsies as a kid growing up. And so for me, a highlight was seeing the Brooklyn Bridge. You know, there's this epic moment there.
Yeah, there you go. Well, that's beautiful. Leads like right into what I wanted to ask, Benjamin. I know you've been all over the world. So, a highlight. What's
Thank
a
you,
highlight
Jay.
for you when it
Thank
comes
you.
to New York City? Anything specific?
Yes, international man. Been to New York City quite a number of times. Just a few weeks ago, recently, with my wife.
Oh, nice.
We went, and she hadn't been there for maybe some 20 years. And I love it, Jay. Great city, great place to travel to. Walking, the subways, the whole deal, feels safer than what you think. To me, I love New York. It's a great place to go and visit.
Yeah. Well, the reason I ask is because today's conversation is with a friend of mine who is a pastor in New York City, and I agree. I love New York City. It is a proper city. That word gets overused, but it's like truly a city. And Drew Hyun is the founder and pastor of Hope Church NYC in the heart of New York City. It's actually a family of diverse churches all over New York City. He's also the co-founder of the New City Network, which is a network of urban churches, and he's a part of the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship team, which is dedicated to helping transform church cultures through deeply changed leaders. And Drew's just an amazing guy, and our conversation, particularly as we explored what it looks like to pastor and to lead a church and to create like Jesus spaces in a place like New York City, was so fascinating. One of the things Drew talks about that you'll hear in the conversation is the limitations of space in New York City and in highly urbanized, congested places like Manhattan. And he talks a lot about how when you're looking for space in a place like New York City, it just becomes so challenging because spaces are small and they're extremely cost prohibitive. And even if you had all the money in the world, he has this great line. He was like, the number that our church was talking about, thinking about, praying for was 21 million. And what he meant by that was there are 21 million people in the greater New York tri-state area, and that's who they're trying to serve and love and reach with the good news of Jesus. And he's like, there's no space on the planet that could fit 21 million people. So we delve into all sorts of creative things that both Drew and other leaders in New York did to be able to share space together, collectively, to be for the city. And so I guess that was a question I had for you guys. In your experience, one, have you ever seen like creative ways that local churches in particular cities or regions have gone in together on a space or shared space with one another across church boundaries to best serve their city? And if you've never seen that, I'd be curious to know, what do you think some of the challenges to doing something like that might be, and what might some of the possibilities be? Sarah Joy, I'd be curious, especially in your work with churches all over the country, have you ever seen something like that?
There's a few examples of churches that are sharing space with each other. Particularly, I think of churches that have maybe a standard meeting in the morning, but then in the afternoon, they might have an immigrant community that comes in and uses the space because they're usually more open to using space at alternate times, things like that. But I would say even in those situations where I've seen that, there's very little interaction between the two congregations. And I always think that that's unfortunate, right? Because you're both using the same building, you're both serving in the same neighborhood, you're both serving in the same mission. And so how are there ways to join forces and work together? There's also a network of churches here in Northeast Minneapolis who've come together for neighborhood events and things like that. And that's been cool to watch that take place. It's not necessarily sharing of space, but it's still coming together and recognizing, hey, again, we're all in the same neighborhood, seeking to serve the same mission and love our neighbors. So how do we do that well together and, kind of have more power in what we can do and more lives that we can affect by the number of people coming together. So those are some of the ways that I've seen it take shape, but not a lot of active purchasing a building together and thinking cooperatively how that would work.
Yeah, that's been my experience too, which is why
Yeah.
Drew's story, which everyone's about to hear, is so fascinating, because that is what they did.
Yeah, I'm excited to
Co-purchased
hear about it.
and literally share space. So, Benjamin, what have you seen around literally the world as you've sort of seen churches all over the place take unique approaches to space?
I know when I senior pastored, Jay, it was so hard initially to get a space, and it gives you an appreciation for just having a building. When we then secured a building, we allowed other churches to use our space. I think the maximum it got up to on a Sunday was a total of 3 churches using it. I think the constraints are both philosophical and practical. You have the practical of just, there's one day a week, right? So are we willing to do services either at night or on different days? But maybe even the greater challenge than the practical is the philosophical, which is it's not just New York City, Jay, that I think is facing this dilemma of, does this model even work to go and spend X number of millions of dollars when you're a church plant, secure your own facility, and then that building largely sits empty during the week? Like, I know it worked 10 years ago. I know it worked 30 years ago. Just a couple of days ago, I went into a big box retailer. Sorry to disclose this publicly on a podcast, but this is the reality of my buying habits. I'm looking at TVs, right? I have no intent of buying a TV in that store. I will purchase the TV online. And I actually came home and said to my wife, how much longer can these retailers exist with the staffing and the buildings and everything else?
Yeah.
Because surely I'm not the only one. So it is with church buildings. The need to reimagine how we can collaborate, use different times, and fill up our spaces more than a few hours a week. I'm not talking auxiliary rooms. I'm saying where we put our money, which is our stage, our production, our auditorium. How can that be utilized many more days a week?
Yeah, that's a great thought. Yeah, Drew sort of acknowledges and addresses some of those challenges, and it was such an interesting conversation. There's some intersections with some of the things both of you have already said, with some of the things that I think our listeners are going to hear him say. So before we get to our conversation with Drew, just want to remind everybody listening, again, this podcast is just one part of a much larger offering of resources that we hope will help you as a church leader and as a pastor as you think about space and its formational impact on the lives of your people. So you can just go to barna.com/making space and access all the resources there. And again, I think our conversation today is going to be, illuminating and insightful. So without further ado, on to our conversation with Drew Hyun. Drew, thank you so much for joining us on the Making Space podcast.
Oh, it's such an honor to be here, man. So thanks for having me.
It's so good that we actually got to meet not long ago in person for the first time at this gathering we were at together. So I was so happy that we were able to schedule you for this conversation, because I personally have so many questions for people who are unfamiliar. You have been a pastor for many years, and you are a church planter. You're not just a church planter. You planted in what I think is the true proper city globally and nationally. You planted in New York City. So let's just talk about that a little bit. And this is not a great question, but just tell us a little bit about the journey of planting a church in the heart of New York City. What was that like?
Yeah, I never thought of myself as a church planter, and I'm actually till even to this day I'm a little bit surprised that we ended up starting a church. I was on staff for 10 years with someone named Pete Scazzaro, who's the author of Emotionally Healthy Spirituality and the founder of a church called New Life Fellowship, a beautiful church there. And after 10 years there, I went through a pretty significant season of depression my final year there, and I ended up resigning unexpectedly. It was unexpected to myself as well as to the whole team at New Life, and kind of went through a desert season of just seeking God and kind of wrestling through my own sense of identity and calling. And through that was God met me in such a significant way of unemployment, of not finding my identity and self-worth in my title or in my position. And then through that, kind of God led us to think about starting a new church in New York City. And so that next year, we ended up starting a church, which would then become a family of churches in New York. The first one started in Astoria, Queens, which is a neighborhood that's near and dear to our hearts. Queens is 50% of Queens is foreign born, and very much the reason why I had moved out to New York City in the first place 10 years prior when I was with Pete was really to work with the urban poor. And so when we started Hope Church NYC in Astoria, it was very much as taking the DNA of New Life Fellowship, the service to the poor, wanting to be a diverse expression of faith in a global city. So we started that in 2012. And since that time, we've started multiple churches out of that first church in Astoria, Queens. And so I currently am actually a pastor of the third church that started out of that original church, where now the original church is now pastored by a wonderful pastor named Christian Hernandez, who leads the congregation in Astoria. So, and then the third church that started is one in Midtown Manhattan. And so that's currently the one where I'm the lead pastor of now.
For those who are unfamiliar with New York City, it might as well be like, 24 different cities. Like you go from borough to borough or even across the street, and it can change demographically and otherwise so dramatically. So talk a little bit about some of your learning in planting a church that has become now a family of churches in a context that is so diverse, yes, ethnically, but socioeconomically and so many other ways. What are some key important factors that you've learned about creating gathering spaces in a city like New York?
Yeah, I think, when I was in church planting training, so we ended up getting assessed by our denomination, got approved, and then we were thrust straight into trainings about church planting. And one of the things that I noticed about church plant trainings is they had a certain kind of formula to them. And most of them had a formula that I would call kind of the Willow Back formula. It was kind of modeled after Willow Creek and Saddleback, which has been so influential in previous generations to the evangelical expressions of faith. So a lot of it was how to create wonderful gatherings, build momentum, have great preaching and have applicable preaching and teaching, how to have good music, good signage, good website, and good media presence and things like that. And what I noticed, though, about that training was so much of it was very difficult to translate to New York. And the reason why was because in a lot of those contexts, the idea was if we create good music, great teaching, great kids programs, and you have to make it better than any other options that people have down the street. The only problem in New York is that it's got the world-class operas and musicals and It's got the Met Museum, the Museum of Natural History, and the best chocolate chip cookies in the city and the best brunch places. So in many ways, like this idea of somehow we're competing against, the consumerist mentality. And then moreover, I think in New York City as well, like Tim Keller, who's arguably the greatest preacher in our generation, was the preacher down the street. And at the time, Hillsong had already started. And Hillsong was arguably, the greatest worship kind of concert-like musical experience. And so in many ways, like the church plant training, so much of it was around try to out Hillsong and try to out preach Tim Keller. And so a lot of me, I was just like, I'd rather my non-Christian friends go to Redeemer or go to Hillsong. Like, I mean, that's kind of where I had, what I had surmised. So what we realized though was, gosh, if we are going to offer a church here, what does missional engagement look like? And for us, one of the things we realize is instead of having this mentality where we're trying to out attract or out preach or out music Hillsong, what if we could just create environments that of people, and the word was presence for us, the presence of a people that really believes in a transcendent God, which is unusual in a secular city like New York, the presence of a community that really loved each other, which also is somewhat unusual in a city like New York, and then the presence of a people that really cared for our neighbors. And what we soon recognized was, gosh, if we can do these things really well, I think we have a fighting chance. And so that was really kind of the impetus for us to. I remember there's actually a saying from a desert father who says, "Go to your cell, and your cell will teach you everything." And I remember in those seasons realizing so much of it was just about praying, getting a sense, really. Getting a sense of God, His presence, His call for us to be a unique expression in the city. And so, yeah.
Yeah, it's so good, Drew. I want to ask you more specifically. There's some unique dynamics, even spatially. Obviously, on this podcast, we talk quite a bit about formation and specifically how spaces can form people and communities. You've already talked about the desire to initially to serve the urban poor and the diversity with which your church and the family of churches of hope are serving a variety of people. Before we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of, like, I would love to ask you about the hub, but before we get into that, just talk about, in a context like New York, where real estate is just impossible, essentially. Talk about how you think about church buildings, one, for hope, but just let's just imagine that I were a potential church planter saying, Drew, I feel called to plant in New York City. I have no money. How am I going to do this? What do I do? Meet at the park? Talk about spaces for worship gatherings and church communities in New York City, and maybe how you've seen it done in a way that's effective in terms of helping the church flourish, but also be a gift to the city and the neighborhood itself.
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question. And, so much of the conversation around real estate and buildings does have to do with cost of the city. So we as a church, when we were actually the limits, what actually informed our strategy in the early days was when we first started that first church in Astoria, we were meeting at a nonprofit organization that at most could seat about 115 people. And that's if things were jam packed. And so we gathered in that space. And then as we were growing, we started 2 services, and then moving to a bigger space that would have a larger auditorium actually it was something like 10 times the cost of what we were paying. And we didn't have the capacity to grow into that space. And so that's when we just said, well, the way that we started this community was a small, mid-sized community that started to grow organically in intentional spaces and public spaces around the city, whether it was in coffee shops or pubs or whatever else. And we had this one gathering space in New York that was a bit smaller. And what if we were to multiply that throughout the city? And so that's exactly what we did. So it was actually the limits of space that informed our strategy to end up starting new churches and gatherings and that sort of thing. Now, with that said, now the Hope churches all around the city now gather in various spaces around the city, whether they're old cathedrals or chapels, or in nonprofit organizations or in public schools and things like that. We actually, so in those early days, we didn't have an office, a designated space from Monday to Friday to go to, or Monday to Saturday to go to, for 9 years of our church's existence. So we would actually just do our staff meetings early in the morning at a cafe. We would buy everyone breakfast. That was our rent that we paid for office space. And then most of the impetus for us was, hey, let's be in the community, gathering, like kind of like what you mentioned, in parks, in coffee shops, in homes all throughout the city. And then having this central gathering place on a Sunday where we could meet. And so when we finally did invest in a property, we actually invested in a property not for Sunday spaces, ironically, because those spaces tend to be so expensive. Because the capacity to have a building that fits like 200 people, which is not a large building, it costs millions and millions of dollars. So what ended up happening was we ended up purchasing a mid-sized space with multiple commercial floors that fits about 70 people. And we purchased that space so that it could be mostly occupied 7 days a week, as opposed to purchasing a bigger space that would cost millions of dollars that would often only be occupied 1 day a week. So, and then meanwhile, one of the things that we've learned through this whole process, and I know you probably didn't ask about this, but like there's so many beautiful sacred spaces, chapels, and historic churches in the city that are old, dilapidated, and cost millions of dollars in terms of the land value, but the buildings are falling apart and they're unoccupied. And one of the big questions is what's going to happen with these sacred spaces. One thing that we've learned now, being building owners in Midtown Manhattan of a space that's completely different than one of these historic cathedrals, is that pastors and church staffs, our expertise is not buildings. And in many ways, it's also revealed to us, like, it makes sense why some of these buildings are so dilapidated now. They just haven't had the leadership to be proactive in how to best utilize and leverage these buildings. And of course, as some of these older historic churches have lost membership rapidly in post-Christian cities like New York, it really is one of those dilemmas that exists. But we've learned so much now being building owners, and how do we leverage space in ways that would really be thinking about kingdom movement. So,
yeah. I want to ask you more about that. In the research that Barna and Aspen Group did together, one of the questions is pretty interesting. The question was asked, at a Christian church, which of the following is more important to you? That the building blend into its surrounding community and not be easily recognizable as a house of worship, or that the building sort of stand out and is recognizable as a church to its surrounding community. The fascinating, about almost 2/3 of Christians said, no, I think the building should stand out and be recognizable as a church in its surrounding community. And in a place like New York, that's really interesting, because there are churches in New York, but like you're saying, there are places where people go to take pictures because the architecture is really beautiful. But the way Hope does it, in conjunction with, I think, others in the city, is, like you said, to share that space where I don't know physically if someone from the outside looking in would see it and say, oh, that's a house of worship or a Christian gathering space. So I'd love to hear more about that. But for sure, it seems that at least in embodied experience, the people who come and go from that place, the activities that are happening, in that space, it becomes pretty clear, I would assume, over time that this is, at least in some form or fashion, a gathering of, Jesus people or Christians. So talk about that. I'm assuming, and I could be assuming wrong, but I'm assuming you were talking about the Hub NYC. So talk about that space, what it kind of looks like from the outside looking in, and then the activity that's happening there throughout the week specifically.
Yeah, so the building that we purchased, it does blend in. It's a 7-story building right on 31st Street and Park Avenue. So very close to the Empire State Building. And that building, we purchased it. The name of our building campaign was called For the City. And we basically pitched to our church, what if we were to purchase a building not for ourselves, but for the good of the city, that several different organizations, nonprofit organizations, and movements could use right in the heart of Manhattan. And so that's what we've done. And that building is very nondescript, but it was fully renovated and beautifully renovated. And so last year we had 78 different organizations, churches utilize the space, many of them using it regularly. So the building is teeming with energy and activity from all sorts of different nonprofits, faith-based nonprofits as well as non-faith-based nonprofits. The rooftop is utilized when the weather is great for several different gatherings as well. Now, our Sunday gathering spaces that we rent only on Sundays, some of them are chapels that look distinctly like church facilities, and others are like public schools that we utilize as well. But that the hub which we purchased, it was really like we're in many ways like I think when most people think about buildings and churches today across the country, I would say, I think most people are thinking, how many people can I fit in this building on a Sunday? And some of that is built around what are my goals for what the goal of how big our church can be on a Sunday morning. So thousands of people. But in many ways, like our mentality is not, the number that we're looking at is not like, I hope our church gets to be 1,000 people, 2,000 people, whatever. The number that's on my mind is 21 million, because 21 million is the tri-state area. And so as a result, because of that mentality, it's like, there's no way any space could fit 21 million people. But if churches could, in a unified way, be mutually on mission together, serving the good of the city, then at least maybe we've got a fighting chance at that 21 million. And so everything from how we leverage our finances to how we leverage our building then is really with that number in mind. It's not the number of like, how big can my church get or our church get, but how can we begin to serve the needs of the entire city? So, and that's really where the heart of the hub came from.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Another one of the questions, especially sort of in the digital age now, especially after the pandemic when we were all online for a couple of years, in my part of the country, yours as well, it was so locked down. Another question that was asked by Barna and Aspen Group, was about discipleship and formation into Christ-likeness. And a simple question, do you think it's more meaningful online or in person? And I think, unsurprisingly, 2 out of 3 followers of Jesus said, yeah, in person. I would love to know, in a place like New York City, where there are millions of people, but also such rampant loneliness and disconnection, because I think it maps onto any part of the country, really, if you think about just some of the numbers and statistics about loneliness and isolation. What do you think, like, what advice would you give to pastors and church leaders in terms of maximizing their current spaces, even if it's not in New York City, wherever they are, to offer people an embodied opportunity? And I love what you said, not just on Sundays for like 75 minutes, but 7 days a week. What are some ways that church leaders and pastors can begin thinking about leveraging and utilizing their spaces, again, for their cities, just like Hope did for New York City?
Yeah, and I know you've written so much helpful material as well on this idea of in person, face to face. And so I think New York, there were so many young people after COVID, people were talking about the city will never bounce back, et cetera, et cetera. And what was fascinating about what happened was our church grew to be more engaged in person and have more hunger and desire for getting together than we had ever experienced before. And it was stunning because in New York, the spaces were so small and people were still cautiously going back to in-person gatherings. But we've discovered such a hunger for in-person gatherings. And so as a result, I mean, that's really what catalyzed the leveraging of the space of the hub, because the hub really opened in the summer of 2020, right in the heart of COVID. And so that desire for in-person gatherings in smaller to medium-sized spaces, as well as large spaces as well, that hunger definitely exists, I would say, especially amongst the next generation. That's what we're sensing in New York, is that people want to get together, be together, eat together. And so much of our discipleship is shaped around that. I know that our discipleship pathway, Alpha, of course, around hospitality, emotionally healthy discipleship. Now, we offer online options for those still, but for the most part, I think face-to-face, in-person gatherings and leveraging every space that we can. So it is a joy to see the building that we purchased, because initially, much was being said about the demise of spaces, New York, no one's going to want to live here. But once, as COVID was winding down, to see that the building has had such a disproportionately impactful, positive impact for nonprofits and for so many of these different organizations and churches has been such a gift for us. So I would say how leveraging spaces to convene people, whether it's interest group or neighborhood or people that just want to be served, I think is a significant gift to the neighborhood as well as the cities in which churches are embedded.
Yeah, that's a really good word, Drew. I think one of the temptations for church leaders, especially, listening from and learning from a leader like you, who is from the outside looking in, having a successful impact in such a challenging city, and really, again, from the outside looking in, like, oh my gosh, New York City, amazing. There can be this sense of like, oh, well, I'm not in New York City and I'm not as innovative or creative or whatever. Just, one of the things I appreciate about you and the brief time we've gotten to be together is your gentleness, your humility, and your real love for just the local church at large. Would you just give sort of a final closing pastoral word of encouragement to church leaders who might be listening today, who might feel that challenge, man? I want to be for my city, but I don't live in New York City, or I don't have those types of resources, or I'm not that creative. Would you just give sort of a final word of encouragement to all of us?
Yeah, and I don't know how encouraging this will be, but that saying from the Desert Father that I mentioned earlier, if you go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything. And I think contextualization matters a lot, like being relevant to one's neighborhood and things like that. But also a significant part of contextualization, especially of what I think this next generation is longing for in any situation, is someone who's authentically living out who they are. Now, one of the beauties of, I think, the Christian message is that it beckons us to live authentically out of who we are and to offer ourselves as a broken gift to the world. And I think what happens is I tend to be so cognizant of what other people are doing around the country, and I want to be like them and want to do what they're doing, and I often lose myself in that. And I think the more we as pastors and leaders could lean into our core identity, how God has shaped us, have a rich, deep, prayerful kind of presence, and then take that same rich, deep, powerful presence into whatever context, I believe God gives the wisdom to us as long as we're embodying what Jesus has always been about, the great commandment of loving God and loving others well, which is one of the reasons why, again, emotionally healthy discipleship has been so formative for me, is because so much of it is around that success is really being with God before doing anything for God. And when I am someone who exists as hopefully a person who's has a vibrant walk with Jesus, and what I offer to the world is not slick programming or great social media presence, but and of course those are wonderful things. I don't want to dismiss that at all. But if I can just offer my own self as someone who's been transformed by the loving grace of Jesus, I think that really makes a difference in whatever context. That's what's timeless.
Man, that's such a great word, to offer ourselves as a broken gift to the world. Drew, thank you for joining me for this conversation, but mostly just thank you for your life and your ministry and your love for Jesus and his church. It means a lot. It's been so fun getting to know you, and thank you for joining us on the Making Space podcast.
Thanks, man. Yeah, and hope you can visit sometime in New York. And
Yeah,
can't wait to get together, man. Yeah.
Yep. Hey, thank you guys again for joining us for another episode of the Making Space podcast. As always, you can learn more about the research that Barna and Aspen Group have been doing together, all of our findings and learnings that we hope will be helpful to you. Just go to barna.com/makingspace and access all the information and resources there. And if this podcast is encouraging or inspiring or thought-provoking to you, we would really, really encourage you to leave a rating or review where you listen to podcasts. Share it with your friends. It's a huge help to us. And again, we are so grateful that you're on this journey with us, and we will talk to you all very soon on the next episode of the Making Space podcast.